Let's have a look at the 12th century Teutonic sword from Balaur arms. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So this is a sword which is sold through Kult of Athena. Link below directly to the product. You can check it out there. And this is through their Balaur arms brand, I suppose, which is Kult of Athena's own brand, and they use various different manufacturers. Now, the first thing to say is that Balaur arms have already used a few different manufacturers, and this particular model is made by Windlass, as it happens. Now, the next thing to say about it is that the 12th century Teutonic sword, according to my opinion and my knowledge and education, is not really a 12th century Teutonic sword. So I've got no problem calling it German or just generally European. It's a style of European sword we actually see in medieval art from across Europe. But this specific type of crescent-shaped pommel really, in my opinion, puts it into the 13th century, not the 12th century. So personally, based on the iconography, manuscripts, sculptures, things like this, that I've looked up, I would place this around 1250, which for those of you who are unaware is the 13th century. So the 13th century is 1201 to 1301. The 12th century would be 1101 to 1201. So although this is marketed as a 12th century sword, I personally would call it a 13th century sword. Now, that aside, the third thing for me to say about it is I really like it, and at around $260, I think this actually presents absolutely phenomenal value for money. Now, often when people review swords, I think they don't necessarily compare like with like, and clearly I'm not going to compare this with $1,000 sword or even a $500 sword, although I think this would compare very favourably with lots of $500 swords out there. And I have to be honest, there are some $700 swords which I don't think are as good as this. Now, how am I defining good? When I say good, I mean as similar to a real medieval sword. So, there are some swords out there which can be perfectly good, well-made swords, functional swords, you know, good edge retention, good quality steel, tough, you know, nicely made grip, nicely made scabbard, blah, 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 all of this stuff. But they are not necessarily very close to actual medieval swords. Now, I am in the lucky and enviable position that I've spent the last 30 years of my life studying real medieval weapons, and I have handled a number of genuine medieval swords and dozens of genuine medieval swords in my life, but I have handled a number of genuine 12th and 13th century swords of approximately this type. And they do have some very specific features to them, and they do tend to be, not always, but they all tend to be, have quite a fair amount of presence in the blade, and they handle in a certain way. And I've spoken about this in previous videos, and one of the reasons for that is you have to bear in mind that the knightly sword in this time, what context is it being used in? It's being used by knights who are predominantly wearing mail, commonly known as chainmail these days, in either open-faced conical helmets or great helms with a shield. So that gives you a very specific context to these swords. They are cut and thrust swords, but they are used a lot for cutting. They're not yet in the age of plate armour, so they're not specialised thrusting swords. They have blades which are optimised for the cut as much as a straight sword can be, and they are intended to be used with shields, and very often they're intended to be used from horseback. So the swords of this period have very particular characteristics to them, and I believe that this has been captured really quite well actually in this sword. Now, first thing, for $260, not only are you getting a sword which I think is a pretty good replica and representation of a 13th century sword, knightly, doesn't have to be knightly sword, could be sort of a relatively well-equipped foot soldier as well, but let's call it a knightly sword, knightly arming sword. Not only are you getting a good representation of that sword, and I think at $260 that would be phenomenally good value. I mean, I can't think of really any brands off the top of my head that are offering that historical accuracy for that price point. But you also get a scabbard with it, and you know, Full disclosure, these are made by Windlass, and the Windlass, as you know, I've been working with Windlass. They know what they're doing, and these scabbards are wood-lined scabbards. They have risers on them. In this case, they are hand stitched down the back, and they have a steel, in this case, chape at the end. It's basic. They don't have any locket at the top, and they do have a rain guard. So actually, these are not dissimilar scabbards to some of the things I've been looking at recently at higher price points. Now, so let's dispense with the scabbard for a minute. The scabbard's perfectly well made and very good, and I think it's amazing that you're essentially getting it for free, a wood-lined scabbard, which would take you hours to make, thrown in for what's really a very low price. Now let's have a look at the sword. So I'm not going to bother listing all of the stats, okay? The fact is, the link's below. You can check out the stats on there. It's better for you to, rather than me wasting time fumbling around with a tape measure on screen, you can just go and check the stats on there. But how does this handle in the hand? It feels absolutely fantastic, but moreover, it feels quite similar to the swords of this type of arming sword, 12th, 13th century arming sword that I've handled. It balances fairly far from the hand, and this is exactly as it should be. Don't expect this to handle like a side sword or a rapier. It doesn't, and it's not supposed to. This is supposed to be used by someone wearing some degree of armour, usually head to foot mail armour, with a great helm, with a shield. Okay, so this is designed to have an enormous amount of cleaving power. But it is a light sword. Now I've just weighed this exact example, and as I mentioned in lots of it, you know, these are handmade, so they're going to vary slightly from model to model, as the originals all would have done coming out of any workshop. This is 1125 grams, so it's just over 1100 grams, which you might think, well, Matt, that's not really light, but I have to say, it actually feels fairly light in the hand, despite the fact that the point of balance is really quite far. It's about 7 inches from the guard. I know I mix imperial and metric. I'm British, I apologise for that. So, although this has got a lot of cutting potential, it doesn't feel at all cumbersome or heavy. It moves really, really nicely. It moves like a real sword. So good weight, accurate for the type of sword, 1100 grams, balance is in the right place for this type of sword. Now, the fit and finish and overall, you know, proportions of the thing. First of all, I must point out that this is a relatively or statistically unusual pommel. I don't even know if there are any genuine surviving medieval swords with this form of pommel, but it does appear in art in the 1200s. So it's great that it's been represented, and I have to say it's very comfortable. I think a lot of people would find it more comfortable than your typical wheel pommel, and it's or something like a Brazil nut pommel, which are both types of pommels that were also around at this time. It is really quite a comfy type of pommel. Some people might not like the look of it. That's up to you, I can't account for that, but I personally like it. I like that it's of a specific type that was around in the 13th century. There's a couple of manuscripts which show this, so I was happy to have this in hand. Next up is the crossguard. So the crossguard is basic and straight, but it is long, and again it captures the proportions of swords, of arming swords of this time, because they do often have very long guards, and you'll notice it's a short-ish grip. It's not an incredibly short grip, but it's certainly comparable with original examples of this time. But it has I would say, compared to your average, you know, if we look at arming swords across the centuries in the medieval period, it's at the long end of the spectrum for guards. Okay, this is a period when cross guards got particularly long. We don't know why, incidentally, although part of it's probably because you've only got a mailed, chainmail covered hand. You don't have plate gauntlets yet, but you're in an age where lots of people are smashing shields in your direction. So actually, that's your hand protection. Not only is it hand protection from another person's blade, but also when you're smashing into great helms and shields and stuff like this, this is essentially protecting that line there. If it rams into someone's shield, you're not going to break your knuckles on it. So I think protection of all sorts, and we know that cross guards at this time very commonly are very long, so they've really captured it. Next up is how the cross guard, or rather the blade, fits into the cross guard, and we'll just have a look at that. It's not the tightest hole in the world, but it's certainly the right shape, and it's certainly pretty tight, and I would say moreover this is actually quite comparable with historical counterparts. absolutely, if you look at original medieval swords, often they have about that much gap of guard around the blade. Sometimes they're tighter, sometimes they're looser. I know a couple of examples in the Museum of London, off the top of my head, that have got gaping great holes and big gaps around the blade. So that, you know, there's all different. Historically speaking, I would be happy with that. It is comparable with historical examples. Now, in terms of the quality of the blade, the website, you'll notice, lists this as 1075. Now, knowing that this is made by Windlass, I know that Windlass's standard steel is actually 1080. So I don't know whether Cult of Athena have got that wrong. I honestly just don't know. My suspicion, knowing Windlass even better than I know Cult of Athena, is that this is actually 1080 rather than 1075. What's the difference? Not much at all, really. It's a basic carbon steel, well heat treated. There's no problem at all with those steels, and it's, for a modern steel, it's fairly closely comparable to the sorts of steels that are being used for sword blades. It's not a completely sort of modern alloy steel. It is basically a basic carbon steel of around 0.8% carbon, if I remember correctly. So it's kind of right for a modern mass-produced steel for a medieval sword. In terms of distal taper, now I just got my calipers, I've just put a new battery in them, you'll be happy to hear. This clearly does have distal taper, but I literally haven't measured it yet. So let's quickly see what kind of distal taper it's got on it, on this bad boy. So it's around 4.5 millimeters thick at the base of the blade. If we go up about a foot, it's down to 3.8. If we go up another foot, it's down to 3.5. And if we go just sort of a couple of inches down from the tip, it is 2.8. So that's distal taper, isn't it? There we go, from 4.5 millimeters down to about 4, down to below 3 down here. So, or rather, yeah, about 4.5 to under 4, I would say, about 3.8 down to about 2.8. So that's perfectly fine, decent distal taper, and therefore it should be, and I haven't done it with this one, yeah, it should be, yeah, so it predominantly flexes in the second half of the blade, as you would want, and it flexes well. It's actually quite a flexible blade. It is sharpened, so I'm doing this somewhat gingerly. I've already cut myself once today, I don't want to do it again. Yeah, so it does flex around the middle of the blade, but it flexes around here, and the bottom 10 or 12 inches stay pretty much stiff, which is what you'd expect. Now the sharpening, I should say this has got a secondary bevel, but it's not a really aggressive secondary bevel, and it's fairly sharp. I'm going to have no problems at all. I'm not going to run my hands. It's pretty well sharpened, so well done, Cult of Athena. That will glide through water bottles and have no problem on tatami mats. Could it be a better edge? Yes, with some work you could apple seed this edge and make it more of a subtle gradient, and you probably make it sharper as well. I can do that, but I'm not going to push hard against it. It will cut my fingers if I do too much. And it bites a little bit more in some places than others. But it's tidy sharpening. It's been done on a belt sander, I would imagine. It's not sharpened all the way down to the base of the blade, but I don't have a big problem with that. It comes down to here, and that's usually because you can't get the belt sander that close to the crossguard without damaging the crossguard. So it's got about 2 inches of blunt, and then it basically goes into sharp for all the way down on both sides with a visible secondary bevel, but a tidily done one. And as I say, you could turn that secondary bevel with a little bit of work, you could turn it into appleseed edge, no problem at all, and make it sharper. In terms of the looking along the blade, there is some rippling, as is commonly the case with hand-forged blades of any kind, unless they've had huge amounts of subsequent grinding on them. So there is some rippling down the blade, and the fuller does have some wobbles to it. It is a bit wobbly looking down that side, and it is a little bit wobbly. It's a bit more wobbly on this side than it is on this side. Fairly typical for a sort of lower to mid-range Indian hand-forged blade, but remember, these are hand-forged, so you have to take both sides with that. So if it was made on a modern CNC milling machine, it wouldn't have that rippling, But equally, medieval swords weren't made on CNC machines. So actually, if you look at genuine original medieval and Renaissance swords, they do often have some rippling on them. And incredibly often, in fact, usually I would say, there is some wander to the fullers. So you could say, yes, this isn't necessarily aesthetically as perfect as a CNC milled blade would be. But at the same time, it's actually probably more similar in that regards to an actual medieval sword, you know, it could be a little bit better. But at this price point, $260, I mean, that's insanely cheap for what you're getting here as a package. And incidentally, I've got a wooden block down here. If I bang it on there, there's a tiny bit. It doesn't ring amazingly. I think there's a little bit of, there's no visible movement in the guard or perceptible movement in the guard. It could perhaps be a slightly tighter hilt construction than it is. But honestly, I think you're getting a hell of a package here for $260. Basically, that's the upshot. I think this is a very, very well-made package and very comparable. It's not, you know, it's going to fall straight out of the scabbard if I do that. It's not tight fitting in the scabbard. You can come up with these. Oh, and the grip. Didn't mention the grip. Fantastic. Leather, cord impressed grip with these risers along it. Beautiful. I mean, honestly, that grip. Look at the seam on that side there. The seam is as tidy as anything on a £1,000 sword, $1,000 sword. So honestly, I think this is an amazing package for the price and better than a lot of $500 swords that are out there, I would say. So I think this is worth twice what you're paying for it. I think normally if I hadn't looked at the price, if someone said how much is that being sold for, I would have guessed about $500. So fantastic value. Very representative of a type of 13th century arming sword as used by knights after the Third Crusade, I would say, really a little bit after that, more into the 13th century. But yeah, a great type, iconic type, well researched, well executed, seems to be well made. And amazing price point. So go and check out that link now. That is my honestly completely unbiased, I'm not any part of the production of Balaur arms or anything like that. That's my completely unbiased view of these swords. And yeah, if you've got other swords that you'd like to see me review, specific models, then contact the manufacturers or the sellers and say send one to Matt for him to review and I'll do it. All of my reviews are pretty much I get sent all of these for free, so that no single sword is on a higher footing than the other. It's the same basis for all of them. I hope that's been useful to some of you. Thanks a lot for watching. Subscribe if you haven't done already, and hopefully I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.